Introduction. When was the N-word first recognized as a slur? When did this particular offense become unacceptable in broader society? When did the black community start reclaiming the term? This video not only answers these questions, but also presents the controversy over white allies' use of the term, which started as far back as the 19th century. Please be aware that when this video cites historical and academic sources using the N-word uncensored, the quotations shown on screen will not censor it. This video covers these topics. 1. When did the N-word start becoming unacceptable? 2. When did the black community start reclaiming the word? Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. When did the N-word start becoming unacceptable? In his 2021 article, How the N-word Became Unsayable, John McWhorter, a black linguist and self-described liberal Democrat specializing in Creole languages and sociolects, argued that it was only, quote, in the 20th century, with black figures of authority insisting that black Americans be treated with dignity, end quote, that the N-word, quote, began a move from neutral to impolite, end quote. Although this is roughly true when considering broader American society, it is very clear that the process actually started much earlier. Many people, even in 19th century America, already believed the word was so degrading that it should not be used in polite company or by gentlefolk. However, this took a very long time to spread throughout the rest of society. A survey of historical literature demonstrates that by the 19th century the word was widely understood as a deliberately insulting and specifically degrading term by people who considered themselves among the gentlefolk. Avoidance of the term became a class signifier, demonstrating you were genteel and refined. Since only a very small proportion of the population originally belonged to this class, it took decades for the broader public to also acknowledge the term should not be used. Evidence for the class-based rejection of the slur is found extremely early. Black historian Elizabeth Pryor notes that, quote, as early as 1776, a British ex-slave, Ignatius Sancho, who lived in England, showed his disdain for the word, end quote. Importantly, she quotes Sancho observing that the N-word was used by, quote, the vulgar and illiberal, end quote, indicating that Sancho believed that use or avoidance of the term was a class signifier. Pryor comments, quote, Sancho's rejection of the term mirrored his social mobility out of servitude and his class aspiration, end quote. One of the earliest American commentators on the word and its social meaning was Hosea Easton, a black Methodist minister and abolitionist. In a book published in 1837 describing the treatment of black people in America, he identified the term specifically as, quote, an opprobrious term, employed to impose contempt upon them as an inferior race, end quote, and to, quote, express their deformity of person, end quote, demonstrating he was well aware of the meaning and intent of the word. Easton also expressed great disgust for the inhumane treatment Africans were receiving and called on Christians to abolish slavery and improve the condition of African people in North America. A historical work published in 1847 explains that it is, quote, an epithet everywhere familiar in the United States, end quote, adding that it was a term of degradation and derision. This is important not only because it identifies the usage as widespread in the US, but also because it identifies the term's derogatory meaning as equally widely understood. A Christian devotional book published in 1848 describes it explicitly as, quote, a term of contempt. Importantly, the book identified the word Negro as, quote, a proper distinctive term, implying nothing reproachful or offensive, end quote, while describing the N-word as a, quote, vulgar nickname, end quote. A book published in 1858 explaining a mnemonic system of remembering facts and improving memory uses the term in a practice sentence for training the mind, defining it as, quote, a term of contempt which does not become a gentleman, end quote. This is important not only because it identifies the word as a deliberate insult, but also because it identifies the word as unfit for a man of good moral character. This shows the author of the book not only understood that the word was a particularly vulgar term, but also that the author considered its usage to be unethical for gentlefolk. This is clear evidence of an objection being raised in the context of class consciousness. An autobiography published in 1873 notes the word being used of the people used in India and describes it as a, quote, term of contempt, end quote. This shows not only that the word had become extremely widely used, but that even as its usage was extended to other regions and ethnic groups, it preserved its function as a derogatory expression of contempt. A volume of the United States Congressional Record, published in 1884, describes it as, quote, a vulgar, uneducated way of saying Negro, end quote, identifying its usage as, quote, contemptuous, end quote. This book also identifies the word Negro as a proper term. Importantly, this source identifies people who use it as uneducated and vulgar. Clearly, this source believed that this was not an appropriate word for gentlefolk and members of polite society. It's interesting to see this source, even as early as the 19th century, indicating use of the word as an indicator of bad character. A dictionary in 1885 describes the N-word explicitly as, quote, a contemptuous or derisive appellation for a Negro, end quote. Again, note that the term Negro is identified as a proper term. A book published in 1889 by women's rights activist Elizabeth Stanton identified the word as, quote, the strongest term of contempt, end quote, demonstrative of the complex and not always positive interaction between the early women's rights movement and the early black rights movement. A book published in 1893 describing life in the Caribbean identifies the word specifically as an epithet. Again, this shows how widespread the term had become outside the US and how it preserved its derogatory connotation in the process. When did the black community start reclaiming the word? The 19th century also saw early efforts by the black community to reclaim the word for itself. Pryor writes that, quote, African Americans appropriated the word, end quote, transforming it from a labor category to, quote, a social identity recognized by people of color throughout the North and South, end quote. The early 19th century also saw attempts by well-meaning white allies to reappropriate the term. Pryor quotes white abolitionist Nathaniel Rogers, who wrote in 1839, quote, the hideous epithet is glorious to us. We wear it as a plumage in our crest. We glory in the badge, end quote. Pryor writes that Rogers, quote, proposed that white abolitionists adopt the term with pride, end quote, in an effort to rehabilitate it and reduce its force as a slur. However, Pryor notes, quote, Rogers must have quickly found that his African-American peers were unconvinced by the strategy of reappropriation, end quote, observing that Rogers later apologized, quote, lest our frequent use of the hated word should have wounded our respected and beloved colored friends, end quote, explaining he was using the term, quote, to put to shame the mean and ungenerous taunters, end quote, and inviting the black community to, quote, esteem it and use it as we do, end quote. In Pryor's view, quote, Rogers failed to see the reality, end quote, noting that until anti-black sentiment itself was abolished, the word, quote, would never and could never mean the same thing when spoken by African Americans and by whites, end quote. This was well understood by 19th century black activists who deliberately avoided the term. Pryor writes that early black activists considered it a forbidden word, adding, quote, it did not appear in the first African American newspaper Freedom's Journal that ran from 1827 to 1829, nor was it credited to a black activist in The Liberator until the mid-1830s, end quote. This started to change in the 1840s when, Pryor says, black abolitionists James Pennington and Frederick Douglass began using the word strategically, while also explicitly deconstructing its meaning and identifying its essentially destructive use by the white community. Conclusion. The N-word has a lengthy and complex history which is certainly not over yet. The so-called N-word with the soft R has an equally complex history. Although the Oxford English Dictionary identifies this form as emerging at least as early as the 19th century, Professor of Linguistics Jacqueline Rahman says it is uncertain that these records are an accurate reflection of how the word is used in the black community today, due to the different socio-cultural context of the time. Rahman also notes, quote, an ongoing movement within the African American community, end quote, to prohibit use of the soft R-N word, but observes, quote, despite efforts to erase the term from the active lexicon of African Americans, it continues to find considerable acceptance and use as a term of self-reference among African Americans, end quote. Most importantly, discussion of the word and its derivatives belongs fundamentally to the black community. Usage outside that community is fraught with difficulty, including the complex issue of who has the right to authorize such usage. Those are subjects on which white commentary is unnecessary and white opinions irrelevant. Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons: Elias Asfig, Alexander Curzon, Shawnee Young, Andy Chaos, TBLTP, Niels Rethlin, Matthew Simmerall, Thomas Leonard, Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Ezekiel Stacey, Love You More, Noah French, Aaron Johnson, Emily Kugler, A. David Johnson, B. The Heretic, Sean M., Waymore Odhi, Aubrey Vaughan, and Magic Turtle. Thank you so much for your support, and please contact me if I ever pronounce your name incorrectly.